our prayer that we can be a blessing, that we can help Christian teachers understand that they can live for Jesus in education. But it's not always easy, but it is possible. And there are so many opportunities, and they may not be around forever. So my heart would be to say to people, use it before we lose it.
Hello and welcome to Reframing Education, the show exploring education with Christ at the centre. My name's Johnny Thomas.
And I'm James McKinnell. And the focus for today's episode is all about the surrounding landscape for Christian teachers. And we're delighted to be joined by Lizzie Harewood. Lizzie, thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Lizzie, you are the Executive Officer of the Association of Christian Teachers, the ACT. Your background is in law and you taught secondary school English for 12 years before joining ACT. For those who aren't familiar, tell us briefly about ACT. What is it? What does it do?
So ACT, we exist to support Christians working in education. Although the name teachers implies it's only for teachers, that's a bit of a misnomer because we serve teachers and teaching assistants, support staff, leaders, governors, lecturers even, those that work in early years, nursery workers, although our largest constituency does tend to be those that are teachers, classroom teachers, and generally working in the state school. But we exist to support those staff to be salt and light in whatever role God has called them to be effectively speaking for and working for the glory and honour of Christ. And we summarise our work in 3 words, which is to connect, to resource and influence.
Thanks, Lizzie. That's really helpful background on the ACT. What was the motivation for you to step away from the classroom? You did 12 years in the classroom as an English teacher, to step away from that into a more nationwide role.
My own move from the classroom into this role wasn't because I sort of stopped loving teaching. It was partly pragmatic. I'd had a young family and also had to help support my ageing parents who had quite severe health issues. And when I saw this role, it offered a level of flexibility. But I think increasingly, I just felt very passionate that Christian teachers were feeling isolated, uncertain, under pressure. And I saw it as an opportunity to serve not just one school community, but thousands of Christians across the nation.
That's wonderful, Lizzie. And you talk there about both grassroots and serving across the nation. I suppose the role that you've had with ACT, it gives you something of a bird's eye view of what's going on for Christian educators right across the UK. And I wonder if you could speak to us for a moment from that perspective, that bird's eye perspective. Would you say that the landscape for Christian teachers is changing? Is that a helpful way of framing it? And if it is, what strikes you as some of the real encouragements and opportunities at the moment? And perhaps we'll come back later to some perhaps of the challenges as well.
I know this is a bit of an overused phrase. Education is interesting because change is one of its constants. And anyone who's been involved in education for any length of time can see how structures of sort of organising institutions within education have changed, how inspection frameworks have changed, how curriculum priorities have changed, how behaviour management has changed. And even since I qualified as a teacher, educational fashions have come, they've gone, and some of the things that I was taught when I was doing my PGCE have now been debunked and abandoned altogether. And I can give you a long list of things that I was taught that were almost sacrosanct. So in terms of change, I would say, that does happen rapidly. In terms of Christian teachers and perhaps some of the challenges they face now, I think they are different to some of the challenges they were facing a few years ago. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I think there was a period of time where lots of Christians in society, but also in education, felt that questioning some of these progressive assumptions around things like identity or relationships and in curriculum, because there were some heavily embedded ideas, that would be a significant risk to their professional life, to their social life. And there was a lot of confusion about what people were allowed to say or bring up or object about, and many Christians felt a little bit reluctant or just ostracised. And I think in recent years, we've seen a greater willingness to discuss these things openly, debates around things like gender identity in school curriculum, the nature of explicit content in relationships and sex education, around freedom of belief and parental rights. Those progressive ideas were pretty entrenched in many schools around 7 or 8 years ago. And I think now that we've had attention drawn to the damaging nature of these things, and we've also had political and policy change with things like the CAS review, I think these things are being approached with much more balance than they were a few years ago. And I think that's partly because many Christians had the courage to speak up and to insist that, other ideas deserved a place at the table. And there are many secular educators that also did that. But that is a very particular topic. And it's easy, isn't it, to boil down our challenges as Christians as only being sort of topical. At the same time, I think being a Christian education will never be and should never be entirely comfortable. If we're living as faithful Christians, then there will be many occasions when our values stand out, and whether the pendulum swings one way or the other, we should always be thinking about how we can be distinctive. But what encourages me is that we are generally and genuinely seeing way more openness amongst students, children, young people themselves, when it comes to understanding what the Bible teaches, to understanding what Christians believe. So many anecdotes and stories of students asking teachers if they can start a Christian union, if they can run an Explorer course, of students wanting a teacher to help them start a Christian union, and just showing that genuine curiosity about spiritual things, about the Bible. And in fact, one of our recent journals was all on this very phenomenon of young people being increasingly hungry, and the rise in Christian unions, the rise in, just lots and lots of conversations, either in a formal sense, in a lesson, or, at lunchtime. So that's been really, really encouraging, really exciting.
Two main encouragements I'm hearing from you there, Lizzie. One kind of educational, that a recovery across the nation within education, that education is a great place to discuss things and to engage in conversations, even when those conversations can be challenging or require tact and grace in navigating. And another encouragement being spiritual, a real openness to big questions about who we are and where we've come from, and whether the Christian faith answers those questions. Yeah, it's wonderful, really wonderful to hear. On that second one, is that something you've noticed in the last 2 years, 5 years? Where have you felt that dial beginning to turn up?
I would say perhaps the last 2 or 3 years, we've particularly heard of instances where students are asking these deeper questions. And in fact, sometimes Christian teachers themselves are overwhelmed with requests to start lunchtime or after school clubs. We've had a number of ACT members contact us saying, what do I do? I know that I've got to do something because I'm being asked to start a group, but I don't know where to start. And that's great, because that's where we can come in and help and either signpost or equip ourselves. And so I'd definitely say the last 2 or 3 years. And I think that probably reflects something that's going on in wider culture as well. Young people are not stupid. They see that what the world is offering and what contemporary culture is offering is lacking. It's not delivering fulfillment. And I think we're all aware, aren't we? Young people are seeing that they want to understand real truth, real purpose. And we're seeing it in church as well. So my husband's a church pastor, and over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen loads of folks in their 20s just pop along to church for the first time, no Christian background. One of our most recent converts, who we baptised about 4 or 5 weeks ago, he literally just typed into Google, where is my nearest Bible teaching church? Because he'd just been so hungry to find something that, that represents, true wisdom and offers real purpose. And that is being reflected in the younger generation as well, and in schools.
It's wonderful, Lizzie. And if ACT don't have a tagline yet, that would make a good one. Association of Christian Teachers, young people are not stupid.
Well, I'm sure some of them are a bit foolish sometimes.
I'm a teacher. There's definitely some. Yeah. At least a few. That's so positive, isn't it? And that's really what a great encouragement, and seems, I think, in some ways to kind of cut against the narrative of recent years. Actually, there feels like there has been a little bit of a shift recently. You mentioned some of the big issues in education that you think might be coming down the line. What do you think they are? What's your take on that? What are the big things? looming and coming down the barrel?
I mean, there are so many, and some of them are political. Some of them, I think, are cultural. I mean, one challenge we have is that Christian teachers are leaving the profession at the same rate as anyone else. Workload is an issue. Behaviour issues are increasing. There are still recruitment difficulties, and many gifted teachers are leaving the profession, and that's something we should be concerned about, and especially when Christian teachers leave, because for many students, the only Christian they'll come into contact with might be their school teacher. So that's certainly a wider issue that I'm concerned about. When it comes to school or policy or curriculum, there are a couple of things that really concern me. One is the special educational needs crisis, and that's something that is probably a little bit too complex and wide a topic for us to go into any depth now, and it's also a very sensitive issue. So I think that's something that has significant implications for young people, and I think there are lots of things that we're not talking about when it comes to the underlying sort of compounding factors. There are deeper problems that are making this issue almost impossible to navigate unless we get the whole picture, unless we understand what's happening with children when they're very, very young, unless we think about the significance and the impact of family breakdown, unless we think about the significant impact of screens at very, very young ages when brains are developing. I do worry that perhaps there's stymieing of debate because some of these things are difficult questions to ask. And we like there to be a very easy political answer in terms of throw more money at something, get in more support. And there isn't the money anyway. But I don't necessarily think that will solve a problem that is very complex. And I probably don't want to say too much more about that at the moment,
Sure.
but it is a massive issue because children are genuinely in need and genuinely unable to sort of regulate themselves. They don't have the same attention. They don't have the same ability to focus and remember information. It's not that there's anything wrong with their intelligence. Another issue that concerns me significantly is the future of religious education. And this is something that most people don't know anything about. Most people don't realise that RE currently occupies a place particularly in English education. It's different in Wales, so I can't necessarily speak for Wales. But in England, it's not part of the national curriculum. It is, however, part of the basic curriculum, which means that it has to be taught, but there's no national curriculum that underpins what is taught at what stage. And it has its own statutory arrangements. There are things called sacres and agreed syllabus conferences where groups of people of faith will get together and agree what will be on a syllabus for a particular area for the next, I think it's 4 or 5 years. And that means that Christians at the Church of England, then other Christians, other faith groups, teachers and the local authority have to get together, think about what subjects, which religions should be covered, why they should be covered, what teachings are most important to be covered, how, etc., etc., etc. And then a curriculum is devised, and then local schools will adopt that syllabus unless they are, say, a church school, which is free to teach its own curriculum, or academies can choose as well, but many will teach the curriculum devised by the sacre at the agreed syllabus conference.
Are you saying there that the curriculum content will take on the majority religious flavour of that particular area? Is that the concern that you're pointing to there?
So, you see, this is a complexity. So at the moment, this is the arrangement. This is what's been happening in our nation for, decades. And so even though these different groupings are in existence and they have to come to agreements, we are still legally obliged that the curriculum has to reflect that our nation is in the main Christian. So I think that is good. Now, there are different sort of legal interpretations of what in the main Christian means and what reflecting in the main Christian means. But there's been a move recently and lots of lobbying done by certain groups, including humanist groups, to say that actually, if RE has to be taught, it should be part of the national curriculum and power should be taken away from local groups. And actually, the government, the Department for Education, should be in charge of what's in the curriculum and how it's taught. So, as I say, it's very very complicated. The government has indicated that it wishes to move RE into the national curriculum. That will require legislative change. Now, I was fortunate enough to be part of a group that was exploring what this future curriculum might look like. I did come away with major concerns about the content of this future curriculum. And I can't say much at the moment because the content is embargoed. But the underlying philosophy is being proposed, and also just the nature and the amount of teaching about other faiths. I don't have anything against teaching other faiths, but particularly humanism, paganism, and perhaps having more of a sociological and anthropological perspective. That really concerns me because I think RE then risks becoming less about theology, about understanding what religions actually teach, what their sacred texts teach. And obviously my concern is about what the Bible teaches, and actually becomes more about broader social themes and about social engineering. And there's also a concern that there's a great deal of emphasis on how good RE teaching can create social cohesion. And I agree, it really can. It really can. But if social cohesion is instrumentalized, then actually there'll be quite a shallow engagement. Increasingly, some of the materials that have come out in recent years have really concerned me. We're looking at the emergence of sort of quasi-religious expressions. And one example in a resource recently that really worried me was the idea of looking at individual case studies, and that being the sort of primary lens through which you understand people's religious practices. So looking at a Christian who had an interest in Celtic Christianity, who was married to a pagan, but wanted to bring some Buddhist practices into their daily life, and looking at that as their academic study. That really concerned me because there's no ability when you're looking at such a bizarre concoction of that as your kind of primary academic study. You can't really engage with Christian theology. You can't engage with the Bible. It'd be such a cursory and shallow understanding of everything. I think that, I do worry that social cohesion is being instrumentalized, and actually it will just end up producing students with a shallower grasp of religion and less of an understanding of their neighbour who might believe something very different or has a very different culture to themselves. So I do think that could be really, really damaging for our nation.
That's really helpful. It feels like then what you're saying is that there's lots of engagement and openness to some of the bigger questions of life. Schools, pupils are willing to engage with these things, and yet nationally there are real concerns over some of the material that's coming out. And if we're not going more deeply into some of these bigger things, then the lack of cohesion that comes out of that means that actually everybody loses out eventually. Do you feel a bit of a lone voice in that room, or do you feel there are others that are expressing these sorts of concerns?
Well, interestingly, I was on a number of panels that were supporting this curriculum development, and some of the folks that were also very concerned about this kind of new paradigm were religious groups, and particularly Sikhs were in the room very concerned about what was presented as the suggested curriculum framework, because they felt that it was too cursory and too shallow and actually didn't represent what they believe and how they practice their religion. So there was an Ofsted review on religious education, and there's some really helpful things in that review. And Richard Quay, who led that, said that actually the most effective RE is when there is depth of study, and you may look at, say, one or two religions in great depth, because the breadth, although it may feel more inclusive, actually means that understanding is so shallow, and you come away with a lesser understanding of religious kind of paradigms and what it means to be practicing a certain religion. And that's what I think we need to move forward with that understanding that actually depth of study, we can understand how complex religions are, and actually looking at one or two in greater depth, I think could have a greater holistic benefit for students.
One can see that the attraction of kind of reaching for something of a pretended unity by throwing all the different religions into a blender and just serving up a kind of attempt at cohesion. And the alternative that you're suggesting is the more challenging path and potentially the more uncomfortable one, but ultimately more helpful of really trying to understand different religions with depth, understanding what it is that my neighbour really believes, and appreciating that might be very different. And so you can see that the path of least resistance is the blender option.
Yeah.
Well done for trying to speak into that. I'm sure that's draining at times, and but a really important thing. Lizzie, to change tack slightly, on the show here we have guests from independent schools, from Christian ethos schools, from homeschools, people looking to set up explicitly Christian institutions, etc. You yourself have a huge passion for Christians involved in the state sector. That's come through even in our conversation today. And as James mentioned at the beginning, that was your own background before coming into ACT. You've already hinted at some of the reasons, but just share for our listeners, why does that sit so passionately on your own heart, and what do you think the real opportunities are there for Christians as teachers in the state sector?
Sure. I think the first thing I'd want to say is that I have enormous respect for colleagues that are working in independent schools and independent Christian schools who are home educating, and we all have different callings, and we are all, by the grace of God, able to make contribution to the education of young people in whatever guise. I think it's helpful to liken it to the idea of perhaps Christians being the salt in amongst the mix, and then those that are involved in, say, an independent Christian school perhaps being the light on the hill. We have different callings, we complement each other and are working for the glory of God. But I think my passion for Christians being involved in state education, no matter what they choose to do with their own children, is that I recognise its reach and its history, because we know that education in the UK has deep Christian roots, and most of our educational institutions, whether state or private, were founded by Christians. We can go back to the Victorian era when impoverished boys from the East End of London were given the opportunity to go to school, to learn to read, to study the Bible for themselves. And people like Thomas Bernardo, obviously pioneering that kind of thing. And it's a public good. Christians should be involved in something that is part of loving our neighbour. In state education, we build on a great legacy, and we still have incredible opportunities for the gospel enshrined in law. But I think the other reason is that Christians are already working in the state sector. A while ago, I did a bit of digging and looked at some data produced by TeacherTapp. And according to TeacherTapp, around 160,000 teachers in the UK identify as Christians. 45,000 of those attend church weekly, and most of those will be serving in the state sector. So there are thousands of Christian teachers, and I don't know all of their church backgrounds, but if there are 45,000 attending church at least weekly, then many of them are going to be really committed Christians who are shining a light for Jesus, or wanting to shine a light for Jesus, but not entirely sure how to do it. So they will be influencing the lives of millions of children every day alongside their colleagues. So what an opportunity we have to build up our brothers and sisters in Christ, so they can be salt and light, so they can be making a difference, so they can be combating some of the really dangerous and damaging stuff that goes on in schools, so they can be teaching RE faithfully, but also having, classrooms where diversity of thought is permitted, and they can wrestle with some of these big questions. We have a responsibility as well as Christians to seek the good of the nation. Kids are in state schools, and they can help young people to flourish. Yeah, so it's profoundly important and a very significant mission field. I would also say that.
Do you see that the biggest factor then in changing this whole landscape is policy change from the top, or then actually faithful Christians, praying behind the scenes, working at the coalface within schools? Maybe it's both and. But what do you see as the kind of big thing that will just change the shape of the trajectory that we're beginning to see?
I think it can never just be one or the other. I think it's both, and that's why at ACT, as I said before, our work is based around three objectives: to connect Christian teachers together, to resource them, but also to influence the sector. We want to influence the educational conversations by engaging in policy debate, by ensuring that a Christian perspective is permitted by having discussions about policy and the change of curriculum and culture. And I think we have seen that because some of the folks that have changed the narrative on things that are happening in schools, whether you realise it or not, have been Christians. So, for example, the person that brought to light the scandal about our relationships and sex education materials in schools and how widespread it was and how bad it was, as in the nature of some of these, is a Christian. Miriam Cates, who herself was a science teacher who worked in state education and then went on to be a member of parliament. What a wonderful opportunity she had there to influence, policy. But that's not going to be enough on its own, because the human heart is simple above all else, isn't it? There's always going to be problems. There's always going to be things that occur within education that we have to, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. There's going to be something else coming up at another point. So yeah, I would say significant change will only happen when there is some kind of cultural revival, and that will impact culture, and then, will drip down into schools.
Yeah. And you've got a very broad scope at ACT as well, haven't you? Your nursery all the way to university, equipping and resourcing, influencing teaching assistants and teachers and governors, and right across the spectrum there.
Yeah.
But you're not a union, but you do have a membership. What are some of the ways that you've seen people benefit from being part of the ACT then? What can we have access to as members for these things?
I think one of the greatest benefits is that Christian teachers discover they're not alone. And although obviously the main source of Christian encouragement and fellowship should be your church family, I'm convinced of that. I think sometimes if you don't know other Christian teachers, or there's a particular issue you're facing that no one else can identify with because they don't work in a school or they don't have that particular trial at their school, it can feel quite isolating. So I think one is the connection, and we have opportunities to connect both in person and online. We pray together every half term online. We have local meetups where people get together and pray together. And then we have opportunities for people, like we have a leadership network. We had an early career teacher network. We run a course called Faithful Foundations, and that helps teachers in small groups to really think through the relationship between their faith and their professional practice. You don't have to be a member to benefit from ACT, because we hope that, our articles, which are free to read, and our webinars, which anyone can attend, our resources, our conferences, anyone can attend. And we hope that will be a benefit. I suppose we hope and pray that people will see the value of ACT, become a part of it, rather than necessarily thinking, what can I get out of it? But how can I support them to do this work and to encourage and support Christian teachers? So yeah, we're not a union. Provide, I suppose, pastoral support to some extent. Again, not overstepping our kind of our purpose. The local church is the place you should receive pastoral support, but we can help when there are particular circumstances at school. We can advise. We can't offer legal advice. We can point them towards appropriate help. We've got great friends at the Christian Institute and Christian Concern. Hope and pray that our members do benefit. And also with our online platform, I sound like a sales pitch, but we have an online platform where people can, when they become a member, they can find out who's local to me, who could I connect with, and because they're in charge of their own data, they can reveal their email address or their other details, etc. So that's really helpful.
And Lizzie, you've got a national conference coming up in London in October, and we'll include the link to that in the show notes. And there's a document that you'll be releasing at that conference, Living for Jesus in Education, that you've been working on behind the scenes with the Lawyers Christian Fellowship and Evangelical Alliance. And so I hope that will be a great blessing to people as well, and when that releases in October.
Absolutely. That is our prayer, that we can be a blessing, that we can, help Christian teachers understand that they can live for Jesus in education. But it's not always easy, but it is possible. And there are so many opportunities, and they may not be around forever. We do realise that there is a move to make all schools completely secular, to remove the incredible opportunity we have through the daily act of collective worship, which should be in the main Christian, and also to change RE. So my heart would be to say to people, use it before we lose it, and join with us, because we want to support you and pray with you and for you and resource you, and and act on your behalf as well.
It's wonderful, Lizzie. I'm sure people are really encouraged by that. As we head towards the end, Lizzie, we have a standing question, the good book and a good book. So I wonder, is there a Bible passage that has particularly shaped your outlook on education? And is there a book that you'd like to draw to the attention of our listeners today?
So I was thinking about this, and I find it really hard to come up with one Bible passage. So I more see it through a framework, I think, rather than just say one passage. Obviously, Genesis is wonderful. It gives us that wonderful opportunity to contribute to God's work in the world. It also means that it is marred by sin and can be hard. But I think the other thing, so in Ephesians, when Paul talks about working wholeheartedly as if you're working or serving the Lord, so many teachers feel a little bit cynical and a bit grumpy. And I know I felt like that a lot. So remembering that if you're teaching, you're not just serving your students or your line manager or your head teacher, who you may feel very frustrated with. You're serving God, and you're doing something that is a dignified and worthy role. So yeah, in terms of books, I've got a number that I found particularly inspirational on Christian teaching. Probably one of the seminal texts is On Christian Teaching by David I. Smith. He's a Brit, but he now lives in America, and he's director of the Kai's Institute for Christian Teaching and Learning. And I would say that this is probably one of the books that really thinks profoundly at a theological level about what it means to teach Christianly and how that impacts the process of teaching. So that's worth a read. In terms of some of my other favourite books that have an impact on perhaps understanding some of the different worldviews and paradigms that have impacted teaching or education, I would say Sharon James, again, one of my absolute favourite authors. The Lies We're Told, the Truth We Must Hold, Worldviews and Their Consequences. It's really, really helpful. And then Strange New World by Carl Trueman. That's been really helpful, a very good kind of dissection of culture and how, particularly in the West, the emergence of some of these ideas around identity politics, the sexual revolution, around personhood, morality, how they've really impacted our culture and how education has kind of absorbed a lot of that.
So helpful, Lizzie. And we'll include a link as well to the ACT podcast, and particularly for the perhaps the Christian teachers listening, there's a very interesting run of episodes there with titles like Teaching Maths Christianly, or Teaching English Christianly, Teaching History Christianly, which I think people will find really engaging to listen to and think about. Lizzie, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for enjoying this episode of Reframing Education. We exist to open up conversations about Christ-centred education within the UK, and we host fortnightly interviews to inspire and equip educators and parents and leaders as we explore the big question, what is the purpose of education?
So follow, like, share, leave a review. It all helps to grow the conversation. And check out the show notes for other ways to support and connect. And thank you for listening. And until next time, may God fill education with the colour of Christ as we're drawn to the praise and love of our Creator.